Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 20 tonight. In verses 20 through verse 23, I titled this section, The Return of the Faithful Remnant. In the previous verses, Isaiah has dealt with the aspect that Babylon's going to be destroyed. Now then, in these verses, there's going to be a remnant, faithful remnant, that returns from that captivity. Let me again add the aspect, I think I've mentioned this a few times, but it bears repeating numerous times, that Isaiah is prophesying this when Babylon is not even considered anything as far as a nation. The nation that they were all concerned with would be Assyria. And so for these things to take place, you're going to have this world power basically of Assyria, them destroyed, the rise of the Babylonians to that power, and then they are being destroyed, and the remnant being returned. It would be like saying that there's some nation over here that we've never heard of, and someone making a prophecy that that nation is going to be the world power and that they're going to be destroyed then, and after that they're going to allow some people to return back to the United States. That's the type of situation you have as far as the time frame of Isaiah's prophecy and what he's dealing with. So in verse 20, he says, "It shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth." A remnant is a very small group that's left over. These are individuals who have escaped the destruction first at the hands of the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and now then they are still remaining, a small group. They will have learned, this remnant of Israel, they've learned the lesson that God was intending to teach them, for one thing. And that is not to trust or to lean upon these heathen nations that were around them. Not to trust in political power. And to use an illustration that we would be familiar with today, it would be like someone telling a nation not to trust in the United States of America. Instead, Israel was to trust upon God, as opposed to, well, whether you deal with Egypt, because so many times they would run down to Egypt to get help, whether it be the Assyrians, whether it be the Babylonians. Don't worry about those. Trust in God. Lesson that we need to learn in our lives even. Who or what do we trust? Do we trust in things that are of this world? to get us by and to get us through and to see us on through our lives? Or do we trust in God? God is telling Israel, trust in God. That's what the prophets always were saying and teaching them. And in trusting in God, do what He says. As far as your dealings with, from a spiritual standpoint, as for your dealings with a social standpoint. Always trust in God. And so these few individuals, the faithful few, remnant, will have learned that lesson. Place your trust in God, because in reality, God is your strength, not those political alliances that you might make. And so verse 21, he tells them that the remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God. So, the very small number, this remnant, and that remnant is in comparison to the multitude of the nation that existed at one time. Now then, they are going to return to the mighty God. It is the mighty God that had used the Assyrian forces to destroy the northern kingdom and punish the southern kingdom, and then destroyed that army. And the one who would then destroy the Babylonian nation. So they are going to return to him. Someone turn over to chapter 7 and verse 3 in Isaiah. And so nobody has to pronounce that name, I'll read it. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. When we were going over that, do you remember what the name Shear-Jashub means? A remnant shall return, basically, is the meaning. A remnant shall return. What's he saying here? A remnant shall return. This is what you're seeing in chapter 10, verses 20 through 23, going to be the fulfillment of what was set forth in Isaiah 7 and verse 3. A remnant shall return. Take Shear-Jashub and go meet Ahaz. Now why? Because there's going to be a remnant that returns. Now then, with the destructions that are taking place, a remnant shall return into the mighty God. Let's look at this phrase, though, the mighty God, for a second. And turn back to chapter 9 and verse 6. In chapter 9 and verse 6, it says, For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor. Notice this, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. That phrase, the mighty God, is used now here. That Israel is, or Jerusalem is going to return this remnant to the mighty God. Now then, go back to verse 20 for a second and looking at that. And as you read verse 20 and the latter part of it, but stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. Who is the mighty God and who does it have reference to? Not here. You're still in 9:6, yes. No, I'm talking about in verse 20 now. Chapter 10 and verse 20. Jehovah. Right. Now then, in 9:6, yes, it's talking about the Messiah, the Christ. In chapter 10 and verse 20 and 21, that same phrase is used in reference to Jehovah. Because when it says, but stay upon the Lord there is the Hebrew Jehovah. So what do we and how can we conclude in relationship to those two verses or passages? Well, they are one, but they're all the mighty God. Go the other way. And if the mighty God is referencing Jesus in 9:6, and the phrase the mighty God is referencing Jehovah in chapter 10 and verse 20 and 21, they are equal. In other words, Jesus is Jehovah or Yahweh, if you want the modern pronunciation.
Since they're all one, verse 25, that means Holy Spirit and the Father are Jehovah too.
Okay.
Is that a logical way to think, or is that confusing?
To answer your question, let me approach it a different way. The term Yahweh or Jehovah, just as the term God, deals with the three divine beings. It is, if I can use the term, a family name. I know it's not technically a name, but using it as an illustration. And so Jehovah or Yahweh refers to all three of them. It would be like Elohim, which is translated God, and deals, now you're getting into the Hebrew terms, so let me go ahead and add the aspect of the Hebrew terms. Elohim, shortened form is El. And let me also add, Elohim is a plural noun. The singular is Eloah. Okay, that deals more with the aspect or from the standpoint of power or strength. Yahweh or Jehovah, the Jews actually considered that God's name. And so that's why they would not pronounce it, and that's why you have this discussion of, if you look up Tetragrammaton, you'll see a long discussion about the name Yahweh or Jehovah and why I mentioned both aspects. No one knew how to pronounce it. And so what they did, basically, is they had, in Hebrew at that time, only had consonants. They did not have vowels. The vowels were supplied in the speaking. But they didn't speak God's name. They wouldn't use that term. They used the word Adonai. Adonai is translated into English as Lord. And so they put the vowels of Adonai with the consonants of this term Jehovah. That's how you get the term Jehovah. But the term Jehovah deals with the idea of existing one. And one of the early usages of the term Jehovah, and I don't remember the exact location, but God is talking about, by these things I was not known, I was only known by the promises of these things, but now then I will be known as Jehovah. The idea is they were only promises, now then they are existing. Why? Because the idea of Jehovah is existing. Now, that goes back into a discussion of the eternity of God, that God is eternal. That is, there is no time with him. He is simply the existing one. And see, you got me off on a long subject, but when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" What was the response? I am, or I am that I am. He's simply saying, I've always been, I am the existing one. He is stating basically that he's Jehovah. Now then, as you come into the New Testament, you find, especially in the book of John, the use of the term I am. And for example, in John the 8th chapter, I think it's about verse 58, he says, before Abraham was, I am. And the Jews took up stones to stone him, because they recognized that statement as being God. He was saying, I'm God. I have always existed. I am eternal. And I think it's around verse 24 in John 8, where he says, unless you believe that I am, King James adds, he, ye shall die in your sins. Literally, it is, unless you believe that I am. He's using that term as saying, I'm Jehovah. I am that one of the Old Testament that's talked about throughout the Old Testament as being Jehovah. And unless you believe that, you'll go and die in your sins. Okay, Dale.
You can understand their reaction, some of the people's reaction, because they'd seen his brothers and sisters running around, and his father probably doing carpentry work, and how in the world can this fellow say that?
Well,
He had lived an exemplary life.
That's exactly what they did say. We know your brothers and sisters. And so and you remember Jesus' statement, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own brethren. You get those statements as a result of their being familiar with him. And because of that familiarity, they had difficulty accepting who he was. But the entire time, Jesus is teaching them, I am, which is basically the idea of Jehovah. And so when he talks about the mighty God in 9:6, and now then in verses 10, or chapter 10, verse 20 and 21, when he says the mighty God, and yet it refers to Jehovah, while in 9:6 it referred to this child that's going to be born, you thus have Jesus being Jehovah. They're one and the same. But the Father is Jehovah, just as the Spirit would be Jehovah. All three of them. Now then, here in chapter 10 and verse 22, it would not, while Jehovah refers to all three of them, it could refer to one specific one. Here it probably refers to all three of them, just dealing with God, the idea of God. Of course, some would say that at this point in time in the Israelite history, that the idea of the three distinct beings, three persons of the Godhead, was not really revealed unto them at this time, and so there would not have been that understanding. I think that while there might be some truth to that, I think that there's some error about that as well. It's not totally true. The very fact of chapter 9 and verse 6, I think, proves that. And the plural Elohim, for example, in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. He uses Elohim. Why? He's teaching from the very beginning. The plurality, even though there is a unity, and thus a singular verb, plural noun, singular verb, God created. And we see it in English a little bit better, down in verse 26. God said, "Let us make man after our likeness." So we see it in our English translations, even though it's expressed in the Hebrew in chapter 1 and verse 1. But it's a Godhead, a plurality. They might not have understood and had a complete understanding of the nature of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit as is revealed in the New Testament, but they still had some understanding of it. Now then, getting back to chapter 10, we do see that principle, though. The Messiah, this child that's going to be born, is thus Yahweh. Any questions about that? Comments? Okay. Everybody understand it, and when we give you a test over it next week, you'll be able to pass it. See, I knew you would be able to. Verse 22. For though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them shall return, the consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. Someone turn over to Genesis 22 and verse 17 and read that for us. Genesis 22:17.
And in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemy.
Okay, this is God's promise to Abraham, that his seed would be, as it states here, that it would be as the sand which is upon the seashore. How many of you want to go out to the beach and start counting this sand? I know that's what everyone wants to do their entire life, and then you won't even get started, will you? In other words, it's so numerous that it can't be counted. This promise was also stated later. Turn over to Genesis chapter 32 and verse 12. Genesis 32 and verse 12, and someone read that for us.
And now saith, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.
Okay. This is actually stated by Jacob to God in his prayer for deliverance from Esau. That God had promised this. Thou sayest. In other words, God, you have said this. So basically it is being repeated for Jacob. That his seed, his descendants would be so great that you would not be able to number them. Okay, thus we have, though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea. It was a numerous people. Kind of as another aspect of this, it was stated, we mentioned Abraham, to Jacob, when the Israel or Abraham, or not Abraham, but his seed goes down into Egypt. Do you remember how many it stated that go down into Egypt? 70. Some have 75, depending on where you're reading. How many came up out of Egypt? A bunch of them. That's a good answer. The fighting men alone were over 600,000. I don't remember the exact figure. It is estimated that the number that came out of Egypt was anywhere from 2 million, and I've heard the upper figure of being 7 million. So, whichever. Probably somewhere in the middle of that. Egypt's a pretty large place, though. So, you can also understand, though, why Egypt was worried that if the nation attacked them, Israel would join with them and they wouldn't be able to fight them off then.
Just imagine one man leading that.
Poor Moses. One man trying to lead that many people. Think of how much food it would take to feed that many people every day. And I don't even want to take a guess as to how much. Think about how much water it would take. How's that one man going to accomplish all of that? Well, it's going to be miraculous in that aspect. And you remember their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out during that 40 years of wilderness wanderings. But the point, getting back to the point that I was trying to make, they became, while they were in Egypt, a great nation numerically, is the point. God was fulfilling that promise to them, to Abraham and to Jacob and the descendants, that they would be innumerable. Now then, after they left, and they continued to grow and develop and become even more numerous. But that's where it really began when they went into Egypt and the years that they were there. Well, from that multitude, as the sand of the sea, only a remnant returns. a very small number of that multitude of people. Now, why? Because the people, that nation that was so numerous, was suffering a just recompense or a just punishment from God. And that's the consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. It's the consumption of God's punitive action upon the nation, upon the people, for their rebelliousness, for their lack of trust in Him. And so here's an overflowing of action in relationship to God's punishment to them, so that this innumerable nation, only a small number returns. Wouldn't it have been better for them to have trusted God through all this? Verse 23, he adds, "For the Lord God of hosts shall make a consumption, even determined, in the midst of all of the land." The idea of consumption here is the destruction. God will make a destruction of what He has determined as a just punishment upon the land. And we might add a righteous judgment, a righteous punishment upon the land. You've transgressed my will, I'm going to punish you. That punishment is going to be a just punishment in relationship to what comes upon them. God has determined a destruction that is so complete that the Jewish nation will almost be annihilated. Now, it's not because God spared a small number, a remnant. If God had not spared that remnant, they would have been annihilated. Now then, why would they not be annihilated? Because of God's promise to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That was going to be fulfilled in the Messiah coming. And that Messiah would come through his seed, but if all of them were destroyed, then the Messiah wouldn't be able to come through his seed. Therefore, God saved a small number, a remnant, to carry out His and fulfill His promise. But it is a just judgment that God brings. Kind of as an aside, how can man say that any judgment that God determines is not right or is not just? We have that a lot today in our society because people look at an eternity in hell, eternity in torment, and they, based upon their knowledge and their great wisdom, yes, I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, they determine that God is not just because He would send someone to an eternal torment, and that that's not right according to their standard.
Well, that's why Russell come up with his total annihilation. He didn't believe in heaven if you go to hell. Heaven's all right, but you're just dead, all dead. That's it.
And a lot of our brethren now are taking up that mantle that hell is simply non-existence. You simply go out of I wonder what they would tell the rich man in that historical account of Lazarus and the rich man. Oh, you're mistaken. You're not in that torment because you've gone out of existence. Of course, they're not going to say that because they don't believe it's a historical account. They say, oh, that it's not real, it's just a parable, as if that's going to change the facts of it. A Christian Scientist and Ellen White, their views are rather, what I want to say is weird, but I'm trying to find a good term that not to use that one, so I'll use it instead. Their views are just weird. That basically sin doesn't really exist. Sicknesses don't really exist. Death doesn't really exist. It's all in your mind. So it's only in your mind that you're sick. It's only in your mind that you sin. It's only in your mind that you die. As I say, it's weird. And certainly completely out of character and out of reality and reality. And
Well, they say when you show them this picture of World War II and Patton,
it's only in your mind.
body line there,
It's only in your mind.
all that
It's only in your mind. It didn't.
a mental panorama, right?
It is your mental state that everything is in your mind.
They killed my aunt because she wouldn't go to the doctor. She just thought she was.
Well, that is the sad result of a lot of cases like that. You can say the Pentecostals as well. That has become the result of many Pentecostal groups, that people die because they refuse to go to the doctor.
So one of the two things broke leg in the car wreck.
It's in their mind. I mean, how many times do you have to say it? It is only their mind. And if you thus cure the mind, then that goes away. It doesn't exist.
Car wreck wasn't my mind, I tell you that. I got a good memory.
That is their view. That is their doctrine that they teach. It is all in your mind. They escape reality, is what it is, an escape from reality. Maybe so. But what is man to come along and say God's not just in a punishment that he decides? And if you wanted to deal with it a little bit, what would be a just punishment of people who consider the blood of Christ, here's the one that God sent to die upon the cross, shed his blood and suffer such, what would be a just punishment of someone who totally rejects such? Now, what's man to determine that? And to say God's wrong for his decision as to a just punishment.
If you actually look at it in the sense that he doesn't send anybody to that terrible situation.
Well, I know, but I'm using that accommodatively. And yes, I realize, and it's good to point out, and God doesn't send anyone to hell. They do it to themselves by their rejection of truth. But from their standpoint, God is going to send someone to hell for, well, what's a just punishment for that? They think that they know better than God, very simply. verse 24 and going through verse 34 then, he's telling the Israelites in this section, don't fear Assyria. So verse 24, he says, therefore thus saith the Lord God of hosts, of my people that dwellest in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrian. He shall smite thee with a rod, and shall lift up his staff against thee after the manner of Egypt. God is giving comfort to the southern kingdom of Judah that they don't need to fear Assyria. God is using the Assyrians to punish them and to oppress them even as Egypt had done. Assyria, is going to smite thee with rod. He's going to lift up his staff against thee in the same way that the Egyptians had. The Egyptians had done this, now then the Assyrians were going to do it. But you don't need to fear them. Don't be afraid of them. Now, why not? Who's in control? Because he said so, but the fact is, he's in control of the whole situation. So there's no need to fear them. When you recognize God's in control, then there's no need to fear. And we could apply that to so many situations in our life, can't we? When we realize God is in control, well, remember what the Hebrew writer said in chapter 13, verses 5 and 6, that God said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that I may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear what man shall do unto me. God's in control. He's going to be there to comfort and to aid us. Well, we'll stop at verse 25 and pick up there, Lord willing, next week.